The winter sky over Europe in early 1944 carried a cold, metallic silence. It was the kind of sky that seemed to belong to one side only, and for years that side had been the Luftwaffe. German aces like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Rahl flew through it with a confidence that bordered on certainty. They had survived everything the Allies tried to throw at them. They had outclimbed, outturned, and outfought wave after wave of American and British fighters. And as the new year began, they believed nothing had changed. They believed the sky was still theirs. Below those steel-gray clouds, the war had reached its most brutal rhythm. Daylight bombing raids by the U.S. 8th Air Force struck deeper into the German heartland, but the price was staggering. B-17s and B-24s burned in the air, their wings torn away by cannon fire, their formations shattered by the climbing attacks of Bf-109s and the brutal strikes of FW-190s. Entire bomber crews disappeared in seconds, their parachutes never opening. The escorts that accompanied them, P47 Thunderbolts and P38 Lightnings, fought with ferocity, but they could not go far enough. Their fuel limits forced them to turn back somewhere over the western borders of Germany. From that point forward, the bombers flew alone. And the German aces waited for that moment like wolves watching the herd scatter. To the men inside the bombers, it felt like doom itself. The minute their escorts turned away, the contrails of German fighters began to appear above and behind them, growing larger, diving fast. Some days the sky vanished entirely in the blinding white streaks of incoming enemy aircraft. Other days, the first sign of trouble was a sudden burst of cannon fire tearing through the aluminum skin of a bomber. The Luftwaffe still had skill, they still had experience, and worst of all, they still had belief. The belief that no American fighter could challenge them at high altitude. The belief that no American machine could climb faster than a 109 or strike harder than a 190. The belief that nothing with a star painted on its wings could reach Berlin and still have fuel left to fight. Everything the Allied planners attempted seemed to confirm that belief. The P-47 was deadly but heavy, and at high altitude it struggled to match a 109 in a vertical climb. The P-38, fast and sleek, suffered from compressibility problems and engine issues in the cold, thin air of northern Europe. Both could escort bombers, but neither could follow them into the deepest parts of Germany. The Luftwaffe knew this. It was why they still attacked with confidence. German intelligence officers wrote in their reports that American technology had likely reached its limit. They studied photographs of crashed P-47s and P-38s and concluded correctly that these machines were formidable but not invincible. They believed the Americans were trying to build a long-range escort fighter. They also believed the Americans had failed. In the fighter bases scattered across Germany, aces leaned over engine cowlings discussing tactics. They bragged that their Bf-109G models were still unmatched at high altitude. They laughed that the Americans flew heavy wing-loaded fighters that could not climb with them. They believed the FW-190A series still dominated the mid-altitudes where most combat took place. They believed their control of the sky was secure. They were wrong. But at that moment, they had no idea how wrong. On the ground in England, in long steel hangars lined with tools and workbenches, a new shape stood under canvas covers. Its wings were long and thin, shaped for speed. Its nose held the deep growl of a Packard-built Merlin engine. And behind the cockpit, a new canopy design sat polished to a clear shine, offering the pilot a full view in every direction. A bubble canopy, a teardrop shape that transformed visibility. It was nothing like the older versions. It looked faster. It felt faster. It was faster. This was the P51D Mustang, the machine that would change everything. Test pilots had already flown it. They had laughed in disbelief as the aircraft climbed like a living thing eager to reach the edge of the sky. Engineers had measured its performance and scratched their heads at the numbers. It was lighter than it seemed. It held energy better than it should. And at altitude, it behaved like a predator unleashed for the first time. But none of that mattered until the pilots took it into combat. Across the channel, Luftwaffe commanders studied their dwindling resources. They still had experienced pilots, but fewer every month. They still had excellent aircraft, but production had slowed. Fuel shortages were beginning to appear. Yet they believed hope remained. All they needed was one more season of superiority. The P51D was already preparing to take that season away. In January 1944, bomber crews whispered rumors about it. They said a new fighter was coming, something fast enough to stay with them all the way to Berlin, something that could outclimb a 109, something that could go the distance, fight the Luftwaffe, and still bring the bomber crews home. Most did not believe the rumors. It sounded impossible. No fighter had ever done that. But in a hangar in Debden, a crew chief wiped oil from the side of a new Mustang and shook his head slowly. He had seen machines come and go. He had seen disappointments and desperate improvements. But this one felt different. When he touched the skin of the aircraft, it felt alive. The day it took off for its first high-altitude combat patrol, the airfield fell silent for a moment. The pilots knew they were not just flying a new machine. They were flying the answer to a question every bomber crew had asked for years. Will someone finally be able to reach us? As the Mustang lifted into the cold morning air, its Merlin engine roaring, the ground crews watched it climb. Higher, faster, smoother. It rose into the sky with a confidence that no American aircraft had ever shown over Europe. Across the continent, German aces strapped into their cockpits, unaware that something new was coming for them. Something that would change the way they fought. Something that would end the sky they believed belonged to them. The storm was rising, and the Mustang was its leading edge.
The first time the Luftwaffe saw the new Mustang, they did not understand what they were looking at. At a distance, high above the clouds, it looked like the earlier P51B models they had fought before. Sleek, fast, dangerous, but familiar. Something they respected, but believed they could still outrun or outclimb if the moment demanded it. German aces had faced Mustangs since late 1943. They knew the aircraft was good, sometimes frighteningly good, but they also knew it had weaknesses. The older Mustangs compressed in steep dives, lost energy quickly at altitude, and did not always match the raw climbing power of a Bf-109G. So when the first P-51D squadrons took to the sky in May 1944, German pilots did not flinch. They assumed this new version was only a minor improvement, a faster canopy change, maybe a better gun sight, nothing that would transform a war. They were wrong before the first shots were fired. They just did not know it yet. In England, American pilots gathered around the new Mustang in the early morning sunlight, helmets under their arms, scarves hanging loose at their necks. Mechanics rolled tool carts across the concrete, double-checked the ammunition belts, wiped the oil from the Merlin engines, and stepped back to admire the shape that had arrived like a promise carved in aluminum. The first thing everyone noticed was the canopy, a clear bubble, no metal frames blocking the view, no blind spots behind the pilot. For years, fighter pilots had complained that the enemy always found a way to appear in the one place they could not see. The Germans had the same problem. Every fighter had it, until now. The second thing was the guns. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each fed by thick belts of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. The older Mustangs had 4 guns. Now there were 6. More weight, more fire, more destruction. The pilots ran their hands along the wings, feeling the cold metal and the barely noticeable bulge where the ammunition rested. But the real secret lay deeper, under the cowling. The Packard Merlin V1650 engine, a licensed American-built version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, modified and improved for endurance and high-altitude performance. It was the heart of the machine, and it beat with the strength of a predator that finally understood what it was meant to be. When the throttle opened fully for the first time, the Mustang leaped forward with a violence that surprised even the pilots who thought they had seen everything. The aircraft did not climb, it surged. It rose into the sky as if pulled upward by invisible hands. In training climbs, pilots reached altitudes the older Mustangs struggled to hold, and they reached them minutes faster. Word spread quickly across the American airfields. This is it. This is the one. This is the fighter we needed 2 years ago. And then it went to war. The first combat encounter came over Western Germany. A formation of Mustangs escorting bombers spotted a small group of Bf-109s rising toward them. The German pilots approached with the same confidence they always carried. They climbed hard, angling upward in the steep, almost vertical rise that had brought them victory countless times before. The older American fighters could not match that climb, not at that angle, not at that speed. The Germans expected to burst through the clouds and find the Mustangs lower, struggling to keep up. Instead, they saw something entirely different. The P51Ds were already above them. The German leader hesitated. It made no sense. They had begun the climb first. They had the altitude advantage, and yet the Mustangs were climbing faster, gaining height even as they banked to intercept. It was the first moment of doubt, a breach in the certainty that had protected the Luftwaffe for years. The Mustangs rolled over into a diving pass. 6 guns opened fire at once. The tracers stitched the sky in long red lines, slicing through the climbing German formation. 2 109s fell in the opening seconds. The others scattered instinctively, but the Americans stayed on them. The bubble canopy allowed the Mustang pilots to track their prey with an ease no German pilot had ever seen. Back on the ground, the surviving German pilot wrote in his report, "We could not climb away. They reached us before we could turn. This is a new model, faster, higher." He was right. Throughout May and June, P-51Ds entered combat across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Everywhere they went, German pilots tried the same old tactics, the classic upward spiral climb, the breakout maneuver into the sun, the high-angle dive away from the engagement, and every time, the same thing happened. The Mustang stayed with them. It closed the distance. It matched their climb. It followed their dives. Sometimes it even beat them to the top. At Luftwaffe bases across Germany, aces paced in silence as mechanics wheeled damaged 109s onto the grass. Bullet holes lined the fuselages. Wings were torn. Engines cracked. Pilots climbed down, shaking their heads, unable to describe what had happened. They had met the new predator, and it hunted differently than anything before. Among the German ace community, a quiet rumor formed. They said the Americans had finally built a fighter equal to theirs. Some said superior. Most refused to believe it. But when a veteran ace returned from a mission pale-faced and silent, the rumor turned into fear. He said only one thing: "It climbs faster than anything we have." In the American bases, the opposite happened. Pilots who once feared long, deep escort missions now prepared for them with confidence. They knew they could reach Berlin, fight over Berlin, and still have enough fuel to bring their bomber crews home. It was more than a new aircraft. It was a new kind of promise. And high above Europe, in the cold, thin silence of the upper sky, The balance finally shifted. The Predator had arrived, and the aces of Germany had begun to realize it.
The summer sky over Germany in 1944 no longer felt like the fortress it once had been. For years, Luftwaffe aces had ruled those altitudes with an almost effortless mastery, striking from above, diving through bomber formations, and climbing back into the clouds with the confidence of men who knew no one could follow them. But by June and July, something had shifted. Something subtle at first, then unmistakable. The air no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Mustang. The first major shock came during a mission over Berlin. The city lay under a thin haze of smoke and dust, the scars of repeated daylight raids spreading across its rooftops. High above it, a formation of B-17s and B-24s settled into their long, steady path. Their engines droned with the familiar rhythm that had carried them through countless raids, and their gunners scanned the sky with tired eyes. Inside the cockpits, the bomber crews expected the usual pattern. The escorts would stay with them as long as they could, then break away. Then the contrails of Bf-109s would appear from the sun, then the firefight, then the fear. But this time, everything was different. Ahead of the bombers and above them, a wave of P-51Ds sliced through the thin air, their wings shimmering in the morning light. They did not lag behind. They did not orbit at lower altitude. They flew high, as if daring the Luftwaffe to come up and meet them. On the ground below, at a Luftwaffe dispersal field southwest of Berlin, several German aces prepared to take off. They strapped into their Bf-109 G6s and G14s, adjusting oxygen masks and checking their fuel reserves. They had been briefed on the new Mustang, but they still believed they could handle it. They had handled every American fighter before. They had no reason to think today would be different. The scramble horn sounded. Engines roared. The 109s shot down the runway one after another, lifting into the sky with the familiar whine of Daimler-Benz power. The pilots climbed hard, pressing their backs into their seats as they reached for altitude. Their tactic was old and proven. Gain height, hit the bombers from above. Use the vertical climb against the American escorts. But when they broke through the upper cloud layer at 25,000 feet, they froze. The Mustangs were already there. Not lower, not behind, above. The German leader, a veteran with more than 60 kills, hesitated for the first time in years. He could not understand how the Americans had reached altitude so quickly. Normally, the 109s owned this part of the sky. But now, instead of waiting for the bombers, the Mustangs were waiting for them. The American leader shouted over the radio, "Break and dive on them! Do not let them climb!" The P-51Ds peeled over into a controlled dive, 6 guns blazing. The tracers cut through the sky in long red spears. The first German aircraft exploded in a flash that swallowed the cockpit and left nothing but black smoke. The second spiraled downward, trailing fire. The third tried to break into a steep vertical climb, the classic Luftwaffe escape. It was a fatal mistake. The Mustang followed him. It did not stall. It did not fall behind. It gained on him, engine howling, wings steady, bubble canopy glinting in the sun. The German ace looked back once and saw the nightmare he had never expected, an American fighter overtaking him in a vertical climb. He did not survive the next burst. But this was only the beginning. Through the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe experienced the same shock again and again. Over Stuttgart, over Munich, over Hamburg, over the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Everywhere the German fighters went to intercept the bombers, the Mustangs were already waiting at altitude. FW-190 pilots tried to ambush Mustangs from below. It failed.
Bf-109 pilots tried to escape in a high-angle dive. The Mustangs stayed glued to their tail. Veteran Luftwaffe aces attempted the old energy fighting tactics that had served them for 5 long years. But the P51D did not bleed energy the way the older American fighters had. It held speed during turns. It climbed like a lightning strike. And with the new bubble canopy, it allowed American pilots to track German aircraft in ways no one had ever experienced before. For the first time, German aces felt hunted. In one engagement near Leipzig, a Luftwaffe formation attempted a coordinated attack against a bomber stream. They climbed in tight formation, engines straining, knowing timing was everything. As they reached the attack altitude, they saw the Mustangs again. Not lower, not behind, above. 30 P51Ds rolled into an attack as smooth as a blade slicing through silk. Below them, the bombers continued on, almost untouched. Inside the cockpits of German aircraft, panic began to creep into the voices of men who once spoke with unwavering confidence. Radio chatter filled with disbelief. They are above us again. They are climbing with us. They are faster. We cannot shake them. Aces who had survived the Eastern Front, North Africa, and the 1,000 battles of earlier years suddenly found themselves outmatched. Their skills had not faded. Their instincts had not dulled, but their aircraft could no longer keep up with the enemy that now ruled the upper sky. The Luftwaffe began losing its most precious resource. Not aircraft, pilots, experienced ones, the backbone of its fighter force. Every German ace lost represented years of training, thousands of hours of flight time, and a lifetime of accumulated skill that could never be replaced. The P51D Mustang was not just a fighter. It was a machine designed to erase an entire generation of enemy pilots. And through the summer of 1944, that erasure happened, one altitude band at a time. In the mess halls of Luftwaffe bases, pilots sat in silence after landing, staring at their hands or their boots, unable to process what they had encountered. For the first time, they admitted to each other something they had never dared say before. The Americans now have the better fighter. And once that truth took hold, the fear followed. Above every city, over every bomber route, at every altitude from 10,000 feet to 35,000 feet, the sky that once belonged to Germany was slipping away. Not slowly, but all at once.
By the fall of 1944, the sky over Germany no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a reckoning. Every altitude band that once belonged to the Luftwaffe was now contested, challenged, or completely dominated by the P51D Mustang. The great duels of the early war, the swarming turn fights and desperate dives, were becoming rare. The Germans were fighting fewer battles, not because they chose to, but because the Mustang denied them the chance to begin one. The change did not happen in a single day or a single mission. It happened through hundreds of small encounters that left the same result. A Bf-109 climbing toward a bomber formation, only to find Mustangs above it. An FW-190 diving for escape, only to realize the Mustang was still behind it. German pilots who once dictated the terms of engagement were now reacting, recovering, or retreating. Over the Ruhr industrial region, the transformation became unmistakable. The bombers no longer entered enemy airspace with the nervous tension that once marked every raid. Their gunners still scanned the sky, but the panic in their voices had faded. They spoke with a new kind of confidence. We have cover. They are still with us. Above them, P51Ds flew in tight, disciplined lines. Their bubble canopies sparkled in the cold autumn sun. Their 6 guns were loaded, cocked, and ready. They were not simply escorting bombers anymore. They were clearing the sky of anything that moved. On one September mission, a group of German fighters attempted a classic head-on attack against a formation of B-24 Liberators. It was a tactic the Luftwaffe had perfected. Approach frontally, guns blazing, force the bombers to break formation or take heavy losses. But as the German fighters approached, they saw something they had never faced in earlier years. Mustangs diving from above in a coordinated screen. The P51Ds hit the German formation before it reached firing range. The first burst ripped open the wing of a 109. The second Mustang drifted to the right and sprayed another with a full second of gunfire. Two more German fighters broke left, hoping to escape into a cloud bank, but another flight of Mustangs emerged from the haze, cutting off their retreat. The attack collapsed in less than 30 seconds. Not one bomber was hit. For the bomber crews, it felt like a miracle. For the Luftwaffe, it felt like a nightmare. But for the Mustang pilots, it was simply the new rhythm of war. Meanwhile, fuel shortages and worn engines were crippling German operations. The Luftwaffe could still field aircraft, but not for long durations. Every sortie became a gamble. Some pilots launched with tanks barely filled, praying they would not have to chase the enemy too far. Others fought with worn pistons, cracked spark plugs, or tires so thin they risked exploding on landing. The Mustang had no such problems. The P51D carried enough fuel to fly deep into Germany, engage enemies over their own cities, and then return safely. With its drop tanks, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back again. No German fighter in 1944 could match that endurance. Not even close. In October, the Mustangs began striking German airfields directly. It started with small raids, then expanded into coordinated sweeps. Squadrons of P-51Ds flew low over the runways, catching German fighters during takeoff or just after landing. Mechanics dove for cover. Fuel trucks burst into flames. The Luftwaffe lost dozens of aircraft that never even made it into the air. One German officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "They rule the sky, we hide under it." The Mustang did not simply beat German fighters in combat, it erased their ability to fight at all. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots tried to adapt. Some attempted the old boom and zoom tactic, diving swiftly from high altitude. Others tried to catch Mustangs on the climb. But the result was always the same. The Mustang met them at the top, matched their dive, or simply outlasted them. The FW-190A, once feared for its brutal firepower, now suffered at altitude. Its radial engine lost power in the thin air, and Mustang pilots exploited it ruthlessly. The 109, though still deadly in the hands of an ace, struggled with restricted cockpit visibility. The Mustang pilot could see everywhere. The German pilot could not see behind him. And in a war where seconds meant life, that alone sealed countless fates. Over the Dutch border, in a late October mission, a Luftwaffe ace with more than 70 kills attempted a steep dive to escape two Mustangs. His engine screamed, his wings shuddered, but when he leveled out at low altitude, expecting safety, he glanced back and saw both P-51s still behind him, steady as hunters closing on wounded prey. He was shot down moments later. Across dozens of airfields, German mechanics gathered wrecked aircraft by the dozens. Some were burned black, some were riddled with holes, some simply had no pilot returning to land them. In the officers' mess halls, the silence grew heavy. Once confident men now stared into their coffee cups, wondering what mistake had led to this. But it was no mistake. It was inevitability. The Luftwaffe had entered 1944 already weakened. The Mustang, finished with time and attrition, had started. The Allies noticed the shift immediately. Bombing accuracy improved. Losses fell. Morale rose. Crewmen who once kissed their dog tags before every mission now spoke with smaller fear, smaller tremble, smaller doubt. The Mustangs got us here. The Mustangs will get us home. Even the German civilians could feel the change. They looked up at the high contrails of silver fighters weaving among bomber formations and realized, perhaps for the first time, that their air force could no longer defend them. The sky that once protected Germany was starting to fade, and in its place came the steady thunder of Merlin engines. By the end of fall 1944, one truth had become unavoidable. The Mustang owned the air.
By the first months of 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a memory, a shadow of what it had once been. The proud organization that had dominated the skies in 1939, 1940, and 1941 now struggled to mount even a handful of sorties over its own homeland. The roar of Daimler-Benz and BMW engines that once echoed across Europe had faded into scattered, disorganized bursts of sound. And above it all, the steady hum of the Packard Merlin engine sang a different truth. The Mustang owned the air. The transformation had happened faster than any military strategist could have predicted. The P51D did not simply outperform German fighters. It overwhelmed the entire structure of the Luftwaffe. It denied them altitude. It denied them escape. It denied them time to reorganize, refuel, or retrain new pilots. Even when the Germans managed to produce new aircraft, such as the FW-190D or the revolutionary Me-262 jet, there were not enough of them, and the Mustang was always there to strike at the moment of vulnerability. In early January, as snow blanketed the battered airfields of central Germany, a Luftwaffe flight officer walked between rows of grounded aircraft. Many had no fuel. Others had engines removed for repair. Some had no pilots at all. Young men stood at attention in the cold, barely trained, wearing flight suits far too large for them. They had studied books but had hardly touched the controls of an actual aircraft. They were told they would be flying sorties within days. The officer looked at them with a sadness he did not hide. He had once flown with the greatest aces alive. Now he was instructing boys who would not survive their first engagement. Above that same airfield, at 20,000 feet, a Mustang squadron circled patiently. They were waiting for movement, a flicker of shadow, a cloud of dust on the runway, anything that suggested the Luftwaffe might try to rise again. They waited because that was the new mission, not escorting bombers, not dogfighting at the edge of the sky. It was something simpler and far more brutal. Do not let them take off. When a pair of FW-190s finally rolled onto the runway, engines straining in the freezing air, the Mustangs descended. Swift, silent, precise. The FW-190s never had a chance. They were destroyed before their landing gear left the ground. The mechanics who watched it happen did not run. They simply stood there, shoulders slumped, knowing the war in the air was already lost. Across Germany, the story repeated itself. At Cologne, at Frankfurt, at Hanover, at dozens of small, half-abandoned airfields hidden between forests and rail lines. The Luftwaffe attempted to fly. The Mustang was there. The Luftwaffe attempted to move aircraft by rail. The Mustang was there. The Luftwaffe attempted to repair engines in the open. The Mustang was there. Every attempt to revive the fading air defense collapsed under the relentless pressure of P51D squadrons patrolling day after day, sometimes flying 3 or 4 missions. The Mustang pilots were not reckless, they were simply persistent. They appeared where they were not expected, struck fast, and vanished back into the sky with the ease of men who now understood they had complete control. German civilians looked up from ruined streets and shattered rooftops and saw something they had never seen before: American fighters patrolling unopposed over their cities. The contrails of Mustangs stretched across the horizon like scars carved into the winter sky. For years, civilians had counted on the drone of German aircraft, the roar of interceptors scrambling, the distant thunder of flak batteries. Now there was only silence, followed by the sharp growl of Merlin engines. Inside Luftwaffe command centers, officers debated desperately.
They talked about conserving fuel, about saving aircraft for a final decisive counterattack, about waiting for the Me-262 jets to appear in larger numbers. But the fuel did not come. The pilots did not survive long enough, and the jets, though revolutionary, could not protect their airfields from the Mustangs that circled overhead every morning, waiting for them to land. One German ace said bitterly before climbing into the cockpit for the last time, "I am not fighting the Americans, I am fighting time." And time is already lost. He was shot down minutes later by a pair of Mustangs that dropped on him from 10,000 feet above. To the bomber crews, the difference was stunning. Missions that had once been nightmares now felt almost routine. Losses fell dramatically. Accuracy improved. Morale soared. Crews returned to England with stories of calm flights, of untouched formations, of Mustangs weaving confidently along their wings. "They protected us all the way," one navigator wrote. "We saw no German fighters today, not one." In March 1945, the collapse was total. Some German pilots refused to take off. Others took off but did not engage, diving into cloud cover and fleeing. Many aircraft were abandoned on the ground. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, now existed only on paper. Its strength was measured not in thousands of machines, but in dozens. Its pilots were not aces, but frightened boys facing an impossible enemy. The Mustang had not just ended the Luftwaffe, it had erased the possibility of its return. By April, the skies over Germany were so quiet that American pilots sometimes joked that the war had moved somewhere else. But they knew the truth. This was the end of an air war that had begun in 1939 with screaming Stukas and burning cities. Now the sky belonged to a calm wind and the distant hum of American fighters sweeping through empty air. And as the last weeks of the war approached, every surviving Luftwaffe pilot understood the same truth. The sky was no longer theirs. It never would be again. And high above the ruined cities, the P51D Mustang flew on, the final ruler of a battlefield now silent, victorious, and forever changed.